Okay. So thank you so much for joining us on Let the Healing Begin podcast. I'm your host, Asia. And today we have Cory Rosenke. Did I say that right?
You got it.
How you doing, Cory?
Good. How are you, Asia?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
So, whereabouts are you from?
I am originally from Canada, Alberta and British Columbia, but now I live in Silicon Valley, California, between San Jose and San Francisco.
Okay, born and raised. Well, first of all, how long has it been since you moved?
Yeah, I've been here for 7 years, born and raised in Canada, and I've been here for actually 7 years last weekend.
Okay, well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's go back to your childhood. How was that for you?
Oh man, childhood. I was raised in poverty. I mean, loving parents, but raised in poverty. We were homeless for a season. I would say it was one of those childhoods where I felt loved, but we were in the pinch of economic, like I said, poverty. By poverty, I mean there were times we lived in a tent and gathered berries in the forest. I left home when I was 14 years old, kind of seeking a bit of a better life, and so yeah, that's my childhood in a nutshell.
So do you have brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I got one older brother, one older sister. I'm the youngest of the group. Of course, I'm the only one who lives here in the States now, but yep.
Okay. And were you raised by a single parent, or you had mom and dad?
No, I had mom and dad. It was a rather chaotic home. Dad was searching for meaning from place to place, so we moved a lot. As I mentioned, when we weren't living in a tent, we were kind of renting in a house that we would eventually get evicted from, and then the whole process would start over again. That was kind of our childhood. My dad had his own hurts in his youth, and one of my passions actually right now is to try to communicate to people who they are and what their purpose is, because I grew up in a home where that was not articulated and not felt, and it was chaos. And I would love it if my story and the things that I have to share would spare other people that type of hurt.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. Was there a specific reason why there was so much like in and out of homes?
I would say that it was my dad was in a point of deep discouragement. And when we're in deep discouragement, we tend to make bad decisions. And it was just, if you add that and kind of add years to that type of cycle, it just keeps happening over and over again. And so I would say that was probably the source of it. As I said, my father had lost hope, lost purpose, and as a result, made decisions that his whole family had to experience.
Right. So let me veer off for a second. So what if somebody's listening and they've never heard of like your purpose? How would you describe that?
Yeah. Well, I think that is one of the biggest questions being asked in the world today. It's one of the biggest pursuits that human beings dream about and ponder. And I would say ultimately, purpose starts by understanding who and what we are. I think the reason why there are so many people without purpose today is because we've forgotten, as silly as it sounds, what it means to be human. We live in an incredibly technological age, medical advancements, tech advancements, travel advancements, and yet for all these advancements, we no longer know what we are. We can look at a lion and say, okay, here's a lion, and the purpose of the lion is to eat, the weak deer, so that the deer population stays healthy and it doesn't begin to be diseased and weak. And so we can say we see the purpose for the lion, and we see the purpose for the deer, which eat the grass, keep it trimmed so there's not forest fires. We see the purpose for the ants, who when the deer dies will come and eat the flesh, and it will decay into the ground and it'll turn back into grass. We can look at the earth and say we understand the purpose of that, and yet we don't understand our own purpose. It's a rather sad irony, and yet I think that is exactly the situation that the world finds itself in today.
Okay. So what if there's someone that's listening that just can't seem to figure out what their purpose is? What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, I would say you need to find out who you are and what you are. And I think that will be finding purpose. Isn't something that we can do flippantly. It comes by finally understanding what it means to be human. And one of the messages that I desperately want to share with people is to either remind them in case they knew it and forgot, or to inform them in case they never knew, that more than a brain or a body, you're a soul. And the problem today is when we're looking for purpose, when we're looking for meaning, we tend to be looking to feed biological craving. The whole world is obsessed with our biological selves, the body and the brain, the body and the brain. Every TV commercial, every restaurant, every store, the education system, everything is around catering or appealing to the cravings of your body and your brain. And I believe we live in a world where our souls are starving to death. And this is a great tragedy because our souls are the core of who we are. And so I would say, if you want to find out your purpose, you first have to embrace who you are. You aren't the reflection that looks back at you in the mirror. You aren't the number on your weigh scale. You aren't the diploma on your wall. You are a soul. And until you can grasp that and begin to see yourself in that way, and to be perfectly frank, begin to see others in that way, right? We will continue to live lives without purpose. And we will think our purpose is, when I attain this degree in school, I'll have purpose. When you get that degree, I can promise you, by the legions of people who have been there before you, it's not enough. You'll say, if I can just get to the top of this financial mountain, right? It's kind of the quote, I'll be honest, the lie of the American dream. That says, if you can just possess these things, you will have peace and happiness. You will understand purpose, but you won't. You'll get there and you'll realize it's not enough. Jim Carrey said something a little while ago, which I thought was interesting. He's that Canadian comedian. He said, I wish that everybody would have the opportunity to experience riches and fame, simply so they can realize that that's not the answer. Because most of us are propelled through life thinking, if I can just become famous, if I can just get rich, right? If I can just, like I said, get this specific education, I will have peace. I will experience happiness. The truth is we won't, because what our craving that is deep inside of us is a non-biological craving, and it cannot be satisfied with biological things.
Absolutely. And you know what? Honestly, from my experience, I felt like God created us with that void, with purpose, because I think that really honestly, that void that is there is only something that he can fill. So we run around because we're human, and he understands that, looking to fill it with, like you said, fame and fortune and all these things. And then we acquire those things and we're still empty, and not everyone knows that that's because God has created us with that void so that, we can find our way back to him and he can fill that void.
Yeah, absolutely. And my purpose has been to give name and definition to a certain degree to what you articulated as that void. Right. Oftentimes we live in a world today where it's not just the world, but as a person of faith, I can say this is even true in the church. We've forgotten what words mean, or we have left them as ambiguous. For example, as a person of faith, we use the word soul all the time. We sing songs about the soul all the time, but it's left ambiguous. What is the soul? Most people don't know. Same thing with peace. I often say that I believe that peace is the mega goal of all humanity. It is our deepest desire, is to experience peace. But again, what is peace? It's left ambiguous. I'm saying it can be defined. You just mentioned that void inside of us. I remember when I was a kid, there was a book that came out called something or other about the God-shaped hole, and it talked about there being a God-shaped hole inside of us. And yet, once again, it was left ambiguous. So my goal has been to say, we have to remove the ambiguity and define it. Because as long as we're looking for something ambiguous, we really don't know what we're looking for. And so we can search the globe over. In fact, I would say that the earth is laced with the paths of educated and prosperous multitudes, all trying to find purpose, all trying to find peace. And yet they don't know what they're looking for, and so they can't find it. And so the book that I wrote is called The Magnetic Heart of God, Understanding the Five Cravings of Your Soul. I believe that there are 5 cravings of our soul they're deeper than psychology. They are in our non-biological selves, and it is those 5 cravings that are the source of inspiration and motivation for every human action. They're the motivation to get married. They're the motivation to get divorced. They're the motivation to pursue a degree, or to move into a career, or to leave a career and go somewhere else. These 5 cravings of the soul, and as you just mentioned, ultimately, at the end of the day, I believe God placed these cravings inside of us on purpose, because only in Him can they be satisfied at the end of the day. And so that's why the book is called The Magnetic Heart of God, understanding the 5 cravings of your soul. These cravings were put in us for the purpose that they would draw us back to Him. And the problem we see in the world is we are stubborn and rebellious people. And we don't want to return to Him. We want to do things our own way. And so we look to satisfy these cravings in wealth, in fame, right? In sex, in thrill of some kind, and it's never enough. No amount of money can fill the void. No amount of sex can fill the void. No amount of diplomas on your wall can fill the void. And so my goal, my purpose is to help people define what they're looking for, so that they have a chance of finding it. Because as long as you're looking for something as ambiguous as peace, or as ambiguous as happiness, or as ambiguous as fulfillment, you'll never find it. It has to be defined.
That's so true. And you know what? Like, prior to my becoming intentional with God, like I experienced that void, you know? And now that I'm intentional with Him and I'm actually like intimate with Him, now it's like I don't even need all that stuff that society says that I need for me to actually have joy. Like, it's a peace that's, you know, surpasses all understanding. Yeah. And it's crazy how it just flip-flops like that, you know? Yeah. Prior to, you know, allowing God to come in, you do have that void, and then, you know, and you're out there searching for all these things, and then when you do find God, it's like, I don't need any of that, you know? Yeah. I'm just fine, like, with just Him.
Yeah. And so I've been fortunate in that there have been a whole lot of people interested in the topic of the soul. And so I speak to psychologists and therapists. I speak to atheists, people from all different faith backgrounds. The other day, I spoke to someone who self-identified as a witch. I've spoken to all sorts of different people, and all of them are hungry about information about their soul. They're hungry to have defined what they're actually looking for. And so for me, this is a great source of unity. At least it gives us to that point where we can say, we can be together on this. We can be unified in this. Now, obviously, we're going to end up pursuing those cravings in different places, some of them more healthy than others. But all of humanity is united in these 5 cravings. I'm not sure if I've mentioned them yet, but obviously in my book, I go in depth. But the 5 cravings that have propelled all of humanity throughout life and time are security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence. Every human activity, from every war to every pursuit of peace, from every marriage to every divorce, from every childhood dream, right, to the feeling that those dreams were shattered, all circle around those 5 cravings: security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence. And when you know that, when you know what you're looking for, those 5 things, you have a chance of finding it. But as long as it's ambiguous, like I said, as long as it's just a generic word like peace or a generic word like fulfillment, you won't find it.
Absolutely. Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever, I know you a minute ago, you said you've spoken to atheists before. Have you ever had an encounter with someone that, like, meeting them, they were an atheist, and then they had an encounter with God, and it's, you know, changed their whole life around?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. I'm surprised, actually. I'm amazed at how often that happens. Because when you finally know what you're looking for, when it is defined, right, then all of a sudden it becomes clear where all the dead ends are, where you can't find it. And then it kind of highlights where you can. And so that's why it's so important to me to define things, because as long as it's ambiguous, I know I keep saying that, you can't find it. And so, yes, I've very much had conversations with people where their eyes have been opened, to be perfectly frank, to themselves, and there's an awakening. And I've often had people say, how do you prove that we have souls? How can you prove that we exist beyond biology? And I'll often tell them, the first thing I say is, you are your own best proof. Deep within each one of us, there is an awareness. There is a knowledge that we exist beyond biology that doesn't exist in other earthly creatures. Right? C.S. Lewis once said, cravings do not exist unless satisfaction for those cravings also exists. And so he gives this example. He says, a baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. If there were no such thing as food, there would never be such thing as a craving for food, right? He says, a duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. If there had never been such a thing as water, there would be no such thing as a desire to swim. But we as humanity have cravings for something that is beyond our biology. We have a craving to be connected with a maker. We have a craving to exist beyond 80 and 90 years. And that craving is proof that something does exist beyond biology. That craving itself is the proof. And then I often will tell people this too. This is what kind of catches a lot of people. It's as scientific a fact as you can get. Every culture in the history of the world has come to the same conclusion, and that is that we exist beyond biology. They have different ways of interpreting it. I would say that the reason there are so many religions in the world today is because all of these cultures independently had this awareness of themselves. They existed beyond biology, and then all these religions began to spring as people began to try to explain what they already knew about themselves. Right? So the awareness of our souls was not evangelized like religion was. Right? When the Europeans landed at Plymouth Rock, they believed in a soul, but they did not bring the knowledge of the soul to North America. The Native Americans who already lived here already had awareness of the soul. They brought a religion, but they did not bring an awareness of the soul. Right? When the Romans landed their ships north of the White Cliffs of Dover in Britain, when they first invaded Britain and built Hadrian's Wall, the Romans believed in a soul, but they did not bring the awareness of the soul to the Britons. They already had an awareness of the soul. Long before the continent of Africa was ever invaded or pressured by outside influence, they were all had an awareness of the soul. And so when you consider that every culture, without outside coercion or influence or threat, came to the same conclusion, that is as scientific a fact as you can get, that we exist beyond biology. I often say this story. If I'm sitting in my living room and my son comes running in the room and he says, "Dad, did you hear that loud screech?" I might say, "I didn't hear it, son," and I might wonder if it actually happened or if it's just something going on in his ears. But if my wife then comes in from the garden and says, "Hey, honey, did you hear that loud screech?" I'm like, "Oh, two testimonies from different places. Maybe there was." And then there's a knock on the door and the neighbor comes in and says, "Hey, did you guys hear that loud screech?" I'm like, okay, I didn't hear it, but clearly it happened because there's 3 separate testimonies. Take that and multiply it by thousands of cultures. They all reach the same conclusion. That is as scientific a fact as you can get. We exist beyond biology, and each one of us intuitively knows it. And it's only been in recent years that certain people try to suppress that awareness. But ultimately, all they can do is try, because it always comes back up. That awareness is there.
Absolutely. So it was a question that popped in my mind when you mentioned a moment ago about you speaking to someone that like self-identifies as a witch. Mm-hmm. We have some Christians that are like, "Oh no, stay away from, those type of people." What would you say to that type of Christian?
Yeah. Well, if I was to put on my pastor hat for a moment, I would say that God told us to go into all the world and share the good news with all people. And that means all people. That means people you're comfortable with and the people you're uncomfortable with. That means the people you love, and it also means the people that you better be learning not to hate, right? And so, in my particular case, the door has been open to me to talk to all these people, specifically because I'm not trying to force my faith upon them. What I'm trying to do is help bring an awareness of the soul. And once they know what they're looking for, then I can trust and hope that they will then find the answer, the only answer that will actually bring change to their life.
Absolutely. And I've seen so many people that try to force, religion or, force God down people's throats. And it's like, that's the last thing we want to do, because we all do have free will. God doesn't even force himself on us, and that right there alone can scare people away, when we're actually supposed to be a representation of God, and God is like very gentle with us. So I think that that's really cool. Like the approach that you take, and just the way that you go about it, is get much farther like that. So let's go back to your childhood again. So how old were you when you like got out on your own?
I left home when I was 14, and vowing that I would never go back to that kind of life. I left home with a chip on my shoulder, vowing that I was going to be the best at everything I did. Like I said, that chip, that unrealistic chip, but I was going to prove myself to the world. And by God's grace, and hard work, I was successful in several areas. But ultimately, left home at a very young age, and there were negative effects of that as well. That in itself was its own trauma, so to speak, right? But when we look back at our lives, or I should say, when I look back at my life, I don't want to kind of preach on your program here, but one of the things that I believe about God is that one of the most beautiful things for me is that God relentlessly redeems. People are wrong when they say that, God planned this or God caused this. No, as you just mentioned, our free will, our propensity to do the wrong thing and do evil is what's caused this mess. But God, in his goodness, relentlessly redeems situations. So I can look at my childhood and I can see all the different steps where there was brokenness and where it caused brokenness. But I can testify to say that God took something that never should have happened and made it into something beautiful. And I can be confident, and for that matter, you can be confident, that whatever trial we face, whatever struggle we come into, that if we will turn our eyes to him, if we will connect with our maker, he will make beauty from ashes.
Absolutely.
And that's my story, is God. It's not me doing great things. It's God relentlessly redeeming the situation.
Absolutely. And you know what? When you were just speaking, I heard the word refine.
Mm-hmm.
I heard the word refine. So let me ask you this. Like, I know you said when you left, like you had a chip on your shoulder. Were you just mad at like just the way that childhood went for you, or was it a specific parent like that you were upset with?
I was not upset with a specific parent. I was upset with a lifestyle that I didn't want to, and a cycle of lifestyle that I wanted to break, that I wanted to get away from. The truth of the matter is, wherever you go, there you are. As the old saying is, right? So as much as I didn't want to, I took a lot of that with me. And so a lot of the cycles that I did not want to repeat, I found myself as a husband and as a young husband and a young dad, making those same cycles again, and having to come to a point of realization, and to be perfectly frank, in my case, repentance of those things, to actually then break those cycles. But it's definitely been a journey. It's been a journey filled with pain and with joy, with ugliness and with beauty. But I'm just praising God, because here I am, and I can know that whatever tomorrow holds, I have a God who loves me and a God who will redeem.
Absolutely. So when you left at 14, like, did you have friends to go stay with?
I was, to start with, I went as hired on as a farmhand for a farmer, and so lived in his basement while I was that farmhand. And then I left there, and I was a horse trainer, and I just kind of lived in a log cabin bunkhouse and trained horses. And so that was kind of how my start was, and it kind of bounced around from ranch to ranch. There was a while where I was training race horses and living in a barn. And that type of thing, right? And then finally I became a carpenter after that, and actually got a house. But life was kind of bouncing around like a bit of a, I don't know, gypsy, I guess would be kind of the common way to put it. Yeah.
So did any of your siblings leave as well, like at a young age, or were you just the only one?
My older brother left early, and he kind of went his own route, a much more silent route, so I couldn't even really tell you his story. My sister stuck around, but other than that, the two of us definitely left early. Yep.
Okay. Now, were you guys raised in church at all? Like, had you grew up with, like, was God talked about in your household?
Yep. Yeah. Raised in what we would call a quote unquote Christian home, but a dysfunctional one. Right. And I think that is something that's super important. That's my passion to share. When I talk about the cravings of our soul, and when I talk about them only being satisfied in their maker, and when I talk about the world kind of pursuing these cravings in biological places and being forever unhappy, the same is true in the church. You know, the statistics of unhappiness, the statistics of divorce, the statistics of unfulfillment are very close to being just as large in the church and in the world. Why? Well, it's because it's one thing to say, I need to live in connection with my maker. It's another thing to do it. Right? It's another thing to actually train ourselves, right, to look to him to be the answer for our cravings. Because what we tend to do, what most people do, is they treat God like a sugar daddy. They come to God and they're still looking for significance in their bank account. Only they're now saying, God, I pray to you to make myself, give me a big bank account. And God stands out there and says, hey, you don't need a big bank account to be significant. Come to me. I, the God of all creation, love you. There is no greater significance than found in that. But then we tend to say, thanks, God, but I really want this big bank account, right? And to be honest, people in the church, I believe this is a message that the church needs to hear just as much as anybody else.
Absolutely. And you know what? It was a scripture. I don't know the exact scripture, but it's one in the Bible that talks about us being content in all, in every, thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, like you said, people treat God like a sugar daddy, and we expect him to, like shower us in cash and shower us in this and showering us in that. But honestly, the way that God works is he gives us the gifts, to produce the wealth, and orders our steps on, what to do and where to go and that type of thing. And that's only if we're producing fruit. God is not going to bless the work of our hands if we're not forgiving, if we're not treating people right, if we're not loving others like he does and truly working on ourselves, Yeah.
And the truth is, the closer you get to God, the less you think you need money or health or popularity, because he's enough. And in fact, for most people, I would say when people are seeking, I'm going to say quote unquote blessing, right? But what they're really seeking is biological blessing. They're doing the same thing the world's trying to do, right? They're trying to satisfy a non-biological craving with biological things, right? And when they do that, it's a sheer sign that it's not that they're bad, it's just they're not quite where they need to be. They're not quite where I hope they will get. Yeah. Because when you are truly connected with God, your health is a non-issue because you got God. When you're truly connected with God, what other people say about you is a non-issue because you know what your Heavenly Father says about you. Right?
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. And then not only that, but God has taught me, like, he doesn't, I'm not going to say not really, he doesn't want us to worry about what other people says, Oftentimes, like, when we walk with him, people are bound to say this and say that, like, look at how they talked about Jesus, So, like, God never said it will be easy. So you can almost expect, like, what does that scripture say about those who are, like, in being persecuted are considered blessed,
Yeah. And it says those who want to live a godly life will be persecuted.
Absolutely.
Right? And as you just mentioned, when we look at the scriptural text, that generation literally had the perfect Christ standing in front of them. And yet Jesus said in John 3:19, they prefer darkness. Right? There is a darkness within us that desires to pursue these 5 cravings of our soul. It's the same motivation, right? But pursue them in all sorts of fallible places. In fact, I take it back to the Garden of Eden. It goes right back to the Garden of Eden, where what does the serpent say to Eve? Right? The serpent says to Eve, first off, he says, did God really say don't eat from this tree? Right? It's the same thing he says to us today, right? Is that really what it means? Is that really what God says? Is that really what the Bible says? He says the same thing. And Eve says, of course, yes. But then here's what the serpent does. The serpent says, remember what we're looking for: security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence. All five of those things, Adam and Eve had it perfectly in the Garden of Eden until the serpent showed up. And the serpent said, you know what? God doesn't want you to eat this apple because God doesn't want you to have good things. Do you really want to serve a God who doesn't want you to have good things, right? He made her question her security and her identity, right? And once she swallowed that part of the apple, she was susceptible to the other lie where the serpent said, if you eat this, you will become great and free. So he made her question her security and identity, and then he offered her false and phony independence and significance. He said, you will become like God. Right? And so they rejected God and they lost their innocence. It all came crashing down in the Garden of Eden, and mankind has been casting around in desperation ever since, trying to satisfy those cravings apart from God, where they can never be satisfied.
And you know what? Something just replayed in my spirit as I was listening to you. God has revealed to me, oftentimes well, first of all, we have to get so secure in what and who that God says that we are, the first go round, oftentimes God will say something to us, and then here comes the devil trying to creep back up behind God and cause confusion in what God already told you, and we have to work our way to a space of faith to where it's no, I know what God told me, and God's word is unchanging, so he's not going to come back up behind what he just said and change it. He wants us to be secure in his word, secure in, like you said, our identity. And those are some of the main things that Satan comes after. He wants to confuse you. Oh, well, how can God use you if you're still doing this, if you're doing that, and God, those are God's, I'm not going to say God because it's not his favorites, because God is not a respecter of persons, but those are the people that he likes to use, the people that are in low places,
Yep.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And the scripture is very clear on that God specifically uses people who other people think are down and out, people who we would view as unworthy. He specifically uses them to show us his power and his grace. Absolutely.
For his glory.
Yep.
So let me ask you this. So once all of you, I know you said one of your brothers kind of lives a private life or made his way privately. Now that you guys are adults, are you guys close-knit? Do you have close-knit relationships? And have you guys ever sat down and talked about the way that your childhood went?
You know what? What a great thought you just asked. The answer is no. But boy, I would love to do that. That is something that I think would be healing and connecting. But it isn't something that I've done. But that's a great thought. I appreciate you saying that, because as soon as you said that, I had kind of a quickening. And I was like, I want to do that. Right? Yeah, very true. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. So what was it like? What was it a specific moment where, because I know you said you kind of got back into the world. Did something happen and you were like, okay, God, this isn't working out now, and you found your way back like that? Or how did that happen for you?
Yeah. Well, for me, I mentioned I was that little boy that when company would come over, everyone else would be outside, all the other kids would be outside playing tags, but I'd be sitting in the living room listening to the grown-ups talk. From a very young age, I was that quiet boy in the corner asking the question why. I wanted to know why. I wanted to know why the world was the way it was, why I felt the way I felt, why my parents were making the decisions they wanted to make. I wanted to know why. And so from a very young age, I had turned really young to philosophy. At ages 9, 10, 11, I was reading Aristotle, Plato, Plutarch, Confucius, really into philosophy. I still love philosophy to this day, but quickly discovered that philosophy asks more questions than it answers. You can't discover the question to why in philosophy. So then I turned to psychology. And for years pursued the study of psychology, was really into Sigmund Freud for a while, and his whole idea of the development of personality and what he called the id and the ego and the superego, these kind of strange theories that he had. But ultimately discovered the answer is not in psychology. Once again, psychology asks as many questions as it attempts to answer. Then I turned to neuroscience. I mean, neuroscience is such an amazing study. The neuroplasticity of the brain, how it can literally change shape over time by the discipline of changing the way we think and changing the perspectives we have. The influence of brain chemicals, right? How dopamine affects you, right? How serotonin affects you. It's an amazing study. But what I ultimately realized was the study of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience is the study of mechanism. It's not the study of source. They cannot answer the question of why, which is ultimately what ended up driving me to spirituality, to the spiritual, to the Lord, because that is the only place that you can actually find answer the question of why. And so again, for myself, it was that journey through philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and then ultimately to faith. But I had a very specific moment. I remember sitting in a little library that I had at a specific time, and I was reading a book called The Iliad by Homer for like the 10th time. So the Iliad is one of the oldest known books of literature. It's the story of the Greek gods, right? It's the story of the Romans versus the Trojan War, Achilles and Hector and the Trojan horse. And in this story, it's like Greek mythology. There's all these gods, and some of the gods are on the sides of the Trojan, and some of the gods are on the sides of the Greeks. And the gods themselves are like betraying each other and having affairs on each other and stabbing each other in the back. It's just this chaos. And I remember I had a moment where I sat up in my chair and I said, God isn't like this. And if he's not like this, then who is he? And that's really what drove me in the search to find him, right? And God's word says that when you seek him, you will find him. And there's a lot of people wondering where God is. And I would suggest to him, if you seek him, you will find him. Because a lot of us will ask the question, but then we don't actually do any seeking. But if you seek, you will find.
You know what? And that is so true. That is so true, because we actually have to seek, and it's not like, oh, he's hidden and you can't find him. All you have to do is, have a willing heart and actually seek, and you'll find him for sure. Yeah. You absolutely will. So, are your parents still alive?
They are. They're a little bit unhealthy. They are not together anymore. They're living in different places, but yes, they are still alive.
Have you ever spoke with them, like now that you're an adult, about the things that took place in childhood?
Yes, to a certain degree, to a larger degree, especially with my mother. And with my father, I've definitely spoken to them about it and found a lot of healing. And so that was where I have not spoken to my brother, as you mentioned. I have spoken to my parents, and that has been a good and beautiful thing.
That's good. What would you say? Well, I guess, what would you say like jump-started your healing process along, after getting out of that environment?
Coming to the end of myself. Many of us, unfortunately, and if I could have a wish for your listeners, it would be that they wouldn't have to go this route. But for a lot of us, we have to hit rock bottom before we're willing to actually turn our eyes where they need to be turned. So in my particular case, as I mentioned, I became the very thing I vowed not to become. And I've often shared this in my testimony. I know what it's like to have nothing. And I know what it's like to have some good things. I know what it's like to be abused or to be betrayed. I also know what it's like to experience the pain of realizing I've betrayed someone. I've experienced these different things, and I'm thankful because it has been in coming to the end of myself and realizing that I cannot live the life I need to live on my own. I cannot do this independently. That ultimately drove me to my maker and made it so that tomorrow was worth living.
So how old were you when you started like healing and all that good stuff?
Oh man, for me, again, and I would wish for people to be earlier than this. I would say I am 45 years old right now. And so I would say I was 32 probably before it stuck. I think I had moments before that, but there was still too much pride, too much arrogance, too much unyielded spirit within me to actually have a lasting healing and change, right? And it really took me those number of years before it actually stuck. And it's like, no, I have come to the end of myself, right? And I fully embrace what I think that, God is saying to all of us. And this is, I would say, for myself, and I mean no disrespect to anyone out there who might have a different worldview, but I think this is where Christianity differs from other different faiths to a certain degree. Other faiths say, if you are good enough, if you behave enough, if you get enlightened enough, then you will have a spiritual reward. The Christian faith says, you can't do it. You can't be good enough. You can't be enlightened enough. And so God said, let me do it for you. And so it took me those years before I was able to say, come right to the realization was, you're right, Lord, I agree with you. I can't do it. Will you please do it for me? Will you please bring me that peace, right? Will you please bring me that forgiveness, that sense of worth, that sense of purpose? And unfortunately for me, like I said, it probably took me till I was 32, 33 years old before that stuck.
Absolutely. You know what? I was 32 when my healing journey started. Let me ask you this. I know growing up, you said you grew up in church and whatnot. Growing up, what was your impression of God, or what were you taught?
My impression was that God was great. And yet he was not relevant to me. That, I guess it'd be that type of scenario. If you can imagine someone who grew up as a, where do you say you're Michigan? So that means are you a Vikings fan?
I'm not really into a whole lot of sports.
Okay, well, let's pretend you're a Vikings fan. It's kind of like growing up in a family that cheers for the Vikings. You kind of, so you cheer for the Vikings by default, but you really don't care about football. Yeah. Right? To me, that would kind of describe my faith, right? And ultimately, I had felt like I had a bad lens on my eyes. We had gone through a lot of trouble. I had heard a lot of prayers, but I hadn't seen God deliver us from anything, right? And so I had kind of like, well, God isn't relevant to me then. I kind of left with that type of attitude. And it wasn't until I was older that I began to see the truth behind things, and how I have no doubt that certain things happened in our lives, or in the life of my family, because God was saying, hey, I need to wake you up to the truth here, right? It's to a certain degree, it's like a loving father who disciplines their children because he loves them, right? And it wasn't until I was much more mature that I was able to see that and actually appreciate that.
Absolutely. And you know what? I was just listening to a sermon the other day, where it was speaking about how God chastises those he loves, and like us as his children, like sometimes the discipline can feel not great, mm-hmm. And so it's hard, but if we don't want to be disciplined, then we're not going to be considered his children, and so we look at that like a blessing because he actually cares about us, That's like a parent just letting a child just run around and do whatever. That's not, loving, Yeah. And so we just have to learn how to, ask God, Lord, what are you trying to show me in this? What can I learn from this? How can I be better through this,
Yeah. That's true. Preach it.
I'm sorry. And then, so he just brought something else to me too. Yeah. And then another thing that we do oftentimes is like when we go through discipline or just different things, we always say, oh, this is just the devil. This is just the devil. We often give Satan too much credit, and sometimes people don't understand that God will let us go through things, or he'll send us through things to refine us, or so that we can produce spiritual fruit, or, it produces things within us. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a propensity towards extremes. And so I would even say that in the church, there are certain people who blame the devil for everything, and they err. It's like there's a devil behind every bush, right? And essentially they blame the devil, which is exactly what Adam and Eve did, right? What did Adam say when God came down and was walking in the garden? He said, the woman you put here with me gave me the apple and I ate it. He blames Eve, but he also blames God. The woman you put with me. And then God says, hey, Eve, what's up with this? And Eve coins the phrase, the devil made me do it. Essentially, right? And of course, that's what people do today. They blame the devil for everything, so they never take personal responsibility. But then there's the other side, the other extreme, which doesn't take into account that we have an adversary at all, and we do. There is an adversary that is against us, that wants to bring us down, and it's important that we have a proper balance between those two things.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. Okay, so once you got out like on your own and stuff like that, and you actually got your first place, like what type of career what was the first like real career that you had?
Real career is a good question. I would say that I was a horse trainer for a while, but can I call that a real career? Probably not at that stage. I would say it was carpentry. I was a carpenter. And,
Okay.
And building houses and whatnot. So that was kind of my first career. And that's what my dad had done. And that's what my grandfather had done. So it's kind of a family trade, so to speak.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned that you had gotten married at a young age. How old were you?
19.
Okay.
Yeah. So we met when we were 17 and got married when we were 19, had our first child when we were 20 and our second when we were 21. And our third at 32.
Oh, wow. So like, let me ask you this. When you started having kids of your own, with the childhood that you had, what was that like for you?
I had a deep urgency to make sure they didn't experience what I experienced. Right. And so I feel like, I think that there are certain people out there who will agree with what I'm saying, and that is that kids are an unbelievable gift. Oh my gosh, there is no greater joy than that. And perhaps some people need to hear that as well. People who don't have kids yet but are worried about it. Oh my gosh, the second that you hold your child in your arms, it's like, yeah, there's no higher feeling than this. But yeah, definitely a strong desire to not have an experience the things I experienced. But because I was immature and not healed and prideful and still rebellious in my heart, unfortunately, they had to experience some of the things that I had experienced. Yeah.
Okay. And would you say that your parents are better with your children than they were with you? Because like growing up for me, I went through a lot of abuse and things like that. But like when my sister and I started having our own children, like our mom was completely different with our children, than with us.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that, being a grandparent, allows you to have the joy without the responsibility, right? So I think that kind of gives you it's a new thing, right? Which I'm sure is exciting. So yeah, definitely there was a bit of a difference there for my own self, and I'm not going to blame my parents for this, because to be honest, I had some experiences in my childhood that I kind of blocked out, right? So, but from my experience, I have very few memories of my parents. I still have a few memories, but very few memories of my parents up until I left home, to be honest, my entire childhood. I almost think, like when I think of it, I was raised by authors. I was raised by heroes in books, to a certain degree. That was my life at that time. I escaped into literature. That's how I escaped. And I'm thankful for that, because I know a lot of young people who go through hard times, they're in a different situation and they escape into drugs or they escape into some sort of thug lifestyle. And by God's grace, that wasn't me. I escaped into literature. I did an interview with the newspaper a while ago and was reading the article that he had written, and it was interesting to see how he had written it down. But it was true, where I grabbed a book and my dog and I disappeared into the mountainside, and I would just lean against a tree and I'd be swept away into different worlds, right? And that was kind of my childhood. That was my coping mechanism.
Okay, that's good. That's really good. So I know that you said you pastor too. Like, what was the first sign that God was calling you to become a pastor?
Yeah. So I was a musician for quite a while and got fairly well known. In fact, later in life, I ended up recording an album, and it's been played on radio in about 20, 30 countries across the world. But at the time, I was a musician and I was singing, and I'd kind of lead music in church. And then I started getting requests from other churches if I would come and do music at their churches. So I would travel around, do music at different people's churches. And somewhere in the midst of all that, I fell in love with Jesus. And I didn't start off that way. I just went somewhere places because I was a musician, right? And then somewhere in the journey there, I was like, oh my gosh, Jesus is my savior. Jesus is everything to me. He's my hope. He's my inspiration. And suddenly they couldn't shut me up between songs. I was supposed to go there and lead the singing, and I would just preach, between songs. And then so finally one pastor said to me, why don't you just preach? And I'm like, okay. And then when the second that happened, I was like, I found my passion. I found my calling. I still play guitar. I still lead music, and because it's a gift and it blesses certain people. But my passion is sharing with people the truth of God's love for them.
So how many years have you been pastoring?
All told, I'd say I've been pastoring for about 15 years now.
Okay, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
So like anybody that walks in their purpose or is trying to get to their purpose, they know that there are some tough days, walking in that. So because there's going to be some warfare, because the enemy, he can't stop what God does with us and in us and through us, but he can try to cause delay, right? And by doing that, he'll try to frustrate that and frustrate you to the point where you want to quit. What would you say to someone that's in a season of their life where they're kind of feeling like they want to quit and just walk away from it all?
Yeah. I would say, first off, you're not alone, and no shame. We've all been there, right? And so that would be the first thing I would want to do, is make sure that they know that they're heard and they're seen, because it is a tough place that most of us get to. And most of us get there because we have had it whispered in our ear for so long that we've come to believe it, that this is all there is, that you are the reflection in the mirror, that you are the number on the weigh scale, that you are the diploma on your wall. And I think everybody gets to the point where if that's all there is, it's meaningless. There's no hope. There's no purpose. There's only trying to move from one temporary thrill to another until it's over. And so I would let you know that that is a lie and it's not true. You are more. You are made for more, and you are more. And more than your brain or your body, which you have no doubt spent much of your life catering to. You are a soul. You are an eternal soul, let me add, created in the image of God. There is a misconception, not only in the world, but in the church today, that somehow our soul is mute and passive, that it only activates after we die. The exact opposite of the truth. Your soul is the core of who you are. Your soul is the core of your ambition right now. It is your soul that is tempted to sin, which is why it is your soul that Jesus died for. It is your soul, the scripture says, God watches over like a good shepherd, right? Your soul is the core of who you are. I can't stress this enough to people. The mirror is lying to you. The weigh scale is lying to you. Your own efforts on the wall behind you with the diplomas are lying to you. Your greatest definition and your greatest hope, for that matter, is found in the fact that you are made in God's image, and that God specifically designed you. Just think of that. The master of the universe designed you, me, you, Asia, to live in connection with him. It is an awesome and profound thought. And discouragement comes when we become detached from that reality. And so I encourage people, there's a saying, I'm also a transformational coach. As a pastor, I'm a spiritual coach, transformational coach, and obviously a counselor to a lot of people. There's a saying in therapy that goes like this, that awareness precedes change. Without a new awareness, change in people's lives is very unlikely. We need to come to a new awareness and a new revelation. And so I often find I coach people, everyone from people at Google who want to climb the corporate ladder to people whose lives have kind of been devastated and they're wondering what next. How do I wake up and, try to build something out of my life? So I coach people from different backgrounds. And so my goal as a coach is to help bring people to a point of revelation. fresh awareness, because that is when change happens. And so for the people like you just mentioned who are at the end of themselves, they're in a place of despair, right? I would pray for them, and I would encourage them to awaken to who they really are, who God really says they are. Because when we can authentically do that, it changes everything. And this is not something you can do with a word of mouth. It's going to mean that you have to, it might mean, I should say, that you have to change your lifestyle. It might mean that you need to change your friends or your social circle. It might mean that you need to change your job. But those are small prices to pay to finally attain that abundant life that God has for you.
You know what? That is so good. There's so many thoughts going through my mind right now, because one thing that I've seen, a pattern that I've seen with God is, like as we go from season to season, he'll give a revelation, like, you know, for whatever season that we're in. And sometimes, like when we are, you know, traveling from season to season, he may strip away a job. Okay, your season there is over with. Like in this last season, like God blessed me with this job and it was awesome. And, you know, I was up, they were trying to promote me and God's like, okay, quit. And I'm like, what, God? You know, but I know that he's taking me somewhere else. You know, he's, you know, doing something else, you know, and I can hear, can't you perceive I'm doing a new thing? So sometimes it may be, you know, a job or a home, or like you said, a circle of friends. That was one of the main things for me when I first, you know, started walking with God. God's like, okay, this person, I need you to back up from these people.
Yeah.
And at first I didn't understand it, you know, and then a little while later, God's showing me, you know, stuff is happening and he's showing me their true character, their true hearts, you know, and I'm like, you know, and then not only that, but sometimes, like God will pull us away from the crowd so that we can learn to hear his voice, so that, you know, when he does send us back out there and we're in a room full of people, we can, you know, differentiate his voice from everyone else's, you know. And there's also so much that he produces us in that wilderness season, you know, or that dry season. That's when I grew the closest to God, when he stripped me all the way bare of everything that I was used to and comfortable in. And I actively sought him, you know, carved out time on a daily. And, you know, that quiet place was where I felt and head over heels in love with him, you know? So
yeah, preach it. I say, how many people, and I can say this as somebody who's counseled a lot of people, and it's a lot. How many people have sincerely wanted to come out of addiction or some kind of negative lifestyle, whether it be just negativity or gossip or some sort of unhealthy lifestyle, but particularly we could talk about addiction. They sincerely want to escape it. And they do all these proper steps to get there. And there's one step they forget, and that is a new circle of friends. And that's one of the hardest ones to let go of. Why? Because of our craving for identity. And we've identified with these people, and it's very hard to change our identity once we've adopted one. But that is oftentimes a very important step to start with, at least, until healing has actually latched on for real, right? And then maybe God will send you back as a lighthouse, right? And as a pillar for truth. But that will be a long time later until you are fully healed. Because that's the thing, it is a long time later. That's the kind of thing that kept pulling me back. All those years when healing didn't stick, when change didn't stick, it's because I kept going back way too soon to the places I ought not be going.
Oh, and you know what? Like, as someone that I came out of addiction, and even in my using, like, I'm like, I can't do this forever. I know that I can't do this forever. If I keep doing this, I'm going to die in this. And I'm like, I'm not going to give over myself, you know, to go out like this. But one of the hardest things was like changing the circle of people that I was around. But I knew it had to happen in order for me to make the proper adjustments and the proper changes to actually get out of that lifestyle and actually, you know, start walking in what I knew I was supposed to be doing. And that's because, you know, oftentimes, like, we get these group of friends and stuff like that, and it comes with a sense of belonging, you know, being with these people that are familiar. You know, like you said, we have, you know, that's who our identity is in at that moment. You know, so like when we shake up from the comfortableness of that, you know, it's kind of like, but, you know, as long as we're, like you said, going in there unhealed and really like making the transformation, we're going to keep falling back into that.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so when I say that we are designed to live in connection with God, I don't say that flippantly. I don't say that to someone and say, oh, you know what? It only takes a minor adjustment on your part to live with purpose and healing. No, it'll take a big adjustment on your part. Well, I can promise you it is worth it. It's worth it all and more.
Absolutely. It's so much hard work, but it's like, man, you can't really even put into words.
Yeah. In my book, I liken it to addiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have these 5 cravings: security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence. Our pain, the hurt in our society, in fact, to a certain degree, I think it's the definition of sin, is when we pursue satisfaction for these cravings in fallible places, in places that can never satisfy, right? But we are addicted to finding let's use an example. We're addicted to finding our security in money. It is an addiction. And the same way you would treat an addiction to get rid of that alcohol addiction or that drug addiction, the same steps you would take you have to take that as in the same case is to say, I need to detach, get rid of this poison addiction that I have, trying to find significance in money, and point it to the place, the one place where it can actually be found. Same thing. We're addicted to finding our identity in the people around us. And it's very okay to have shadows of an identity there, but that cannot be our core identity, right? But we're addicted to it, and we have to treat it, as I mentioned, like a drug and alcohol addiction, where we become released from that and find our identity where it's actually supposed to be. And when we do that, I mean, that is where that abundant life, when Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and that you might have it abundantly. We know what abundance is. We can define that in our heads. Oh, abundance, that means a lot, overflowing. But we've forgotten what life is, because we think it is the brain and the body. We think that life is biological. It is not. More than a brain or a body, we are a soul. And if we are going to truly live a life of abundance, we're going to have to start looking in that direction.
Absolutely. Oh, that was good. So, one last question. What is it that you do now? I know you said you are
Yeah, I'm still a pastor.
Okay.
I'm still a pastor, and I also I'm a coach. I moonlight as a coach, and so I have people from my congregation, but I also I'm also for hire, so to speak. People call me, and when they're basically, here's what a coach does. A coach, my job as a coach is to help someone live with intentionality. Someone says, hey, like I said, I'll use I won't get into it because as a coach, I'm very private with people's information, but someone's at Google and they're in this position, but they want to get up here. They want to advance in the company. I help them do that with intention. Most of us, we don't live lives of intention. We live lives reacting to what happens around us. But when we change that, when we begin to live with intention, it is amazing how far we can travel in such a short amount of time by adding intentionality and accountability to our journey. The same is true with a lot of people I coach are people who are just like, their life has been uprooted, oftentimes through a broken relationship, or through they've gone through addiction and they've lost everything, and they're wondering, how do I build and move forward, right? And so I come in and I help them with intentionality move forward. Okay, here's where you are. Here's where you want to be. Now let's get there. And if all we're going to do is react to life, we won't get there. We have to do it intentionally. So I'm a pastor. I'm a coach. I've written a book, as I mentioned, The Magnetic Heart of God, Understanding the 5 Cravings of Your Soul. So I honestly believe that this book will be transformative for a lot of people, that it will give them that self-revelation that they're needing. And so I have a great passion to tell as many people as I can. I'll be honest, as an author, you don't make a lot of money from writing a book. But so for me, it's not about trying to someone buy a book so I can make money, because honestly, there's not much in it. But what I want to do is I've just seen it transform life after life after life after life. And so that to me is my biggest passion right now, is to speak to people like you. And I so much appreciate you, Asia, and I appreciate you allowing me onto your platform so I can hopefully get this message out into people's lives. Man, more than a brain or a body, you are a soul. And if you'll get to the point where this is real to you, where you know it, oh man, everything will change, and it'll change for a good and beautiful purpose and way.
Absolutely. And you know what, honestly, like, this is not my platform. This is the platform that God blessed me with. So, you know, it's his platform. So I just allow him to order my steps, and I take the steps and just follow his instruction, you know. So if people want to purchase your book, where can they find it?
They could go to my website, CoryRosenke.com. That's kind of the centralized location. And then I have their links where ultimately they can get it anywhere. It's if they just type in either Cory Rosenke or the Magnetic Heart of God, the search will come up and they'll be able to get it someplace close to them. So it's definitely will be really readily available. But CoryRosenke.com is my centralized point where you can contact me, or you can find out more about me, listen to different sermons or talks, or for that matter, just order the book.
Okay. I appreciate you coming on and, you know, just like your transparency and sharing the message.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I've appreciated it, Asia.
No problem. Thank you all so much for joining us on Let the Healing Begin podcast. Please head over to www.greatergrowthllc.com and purchase a t-shirt or hoodie. You can also support by heading over to Amazon and purchasing a copy of Back in My Day by Asia Wilson. Please be sure to like and follow us on other platforms. And then you can also check out the link tree to see what other services that we offer. And until next time.